Hello and welcome to this exclusive chat with one of the largest vaccine manufacturers of India, Serum Institute. We have with us the CEO, Mr. Adar Poonawalla, joining in to talk about the business. Mr. Poonawalla, thank you very much for joining in. Let's start with the journey of Serum. It's the largest vaccine manufacturer today, and the focus has been affordable vaccines globally. What's the journey been like, and what are the recent challenges you faced?
Thank you, Ekta, for having me. The journey started in 1966 when my father founded the company, and I took over in 2011 as CEO. The journey started in a very small manner. He started with $10,000 as a startup capital, and today we're producing roughly 1.3 billion doses of vaccines. And when I joined the company, we were mainly focused on India, and we were in 20 to 30 countries. I wanted to expand our footprint to the globe, across the globe, and I enjoyed traveling and registering and expanding the business relationships, and now today we're in 145 countries. We've in fact made a new plant which will also cater to Europe and US, which we're not into, and we have ambitious plans to enter those markets. We've also acquired two companies in Europe, one in 2012 in Holland and one in Czech Republic in 2017, to make injectable polio and some other vaccines for Europe and US and the rest of the world. So we've expanded from a very small capital and very small campus in the 60s to having two major campuses in India and two manufacturing sites in Europe. Our journey now is looking and has a lot of challenges because we're trying to enter the Europe and US markets. We're trying to sensitize the Indian government to take more vaccines and plan and help them in their programs to fight these life-threatening diseases. We've got other challenges from China and other countries where we're offering a red carpet treatment for them to come here. But when we want to go to China, we've got a lot of barriers that we're facing, like, parting with our technology, and we've got to do JVs, things which are impossible. These are artificial barriers which our country, at our country level, has to sort out and open up the markets, to help the Indian companies.
The latest figures that I have in terms of the revenues for the company is around 4,000 crores. You've
Yes.
grown around 25 to 30% CAGR.
Yes.
What are the current financials looking like for the company?
Well, as you mentioned, the turnover is close to about 4,000 crores. What's happened is that as we've grown at a very rapid rate, we are roughly 50 to 60% market shareholders globally for the vaccines that we produce. So now to grow from here in the existing vaccine space is very challenging. It's very rare that a company gets a global market share of 60% for its products. So what we're doing now is the future growth is going to come based on the new products and new investments that we've made, like for dengue. We've got a cure for dengue. We've got a multivalent meningitis vaccine, which is going to be used by all the Hajj travelers, which, when they have to go for their pilgrimage. You've got the pneumococcal vaccine. Pneumonia is a major killer in babies. We're hoping to launch that next year. This year, in fact, we launched the rotavirus vaccine, which is preventing diarrhea deaths and dehydration deaths in children. So it's the new vaccines that we've invested in 5-6 years ago, which will now take on the growth, going on forward from 2020.
So you had a target of around 10,000 odd
Yes.
crores by 2022?
Yes.
Are you on track to achieve
Yes,
that?
very much so. In fact, that involves a lot of investments in infrastructure also. So we've spent about 2,500 crores in our new campus to comply with the latest GMPs and built about 2 million square feet of manufacturing space there. I think with all these new products and with India and Modi ji's push on vaccines and the Prime Minister's new sort of outlook on the health ministry and supporting that, I think we've got a very bright future in India, in the Indian market, which is going to grow a lot also.
Majority of your business is in the tender space. That is basically government contracts
Yes.
within India as well as globally. But the traditional problem with the tender space has been traditionally lower margins and maybe lower tender prices as well. So what exactly would the margins of the company be at this point?
Well, the margins are about 20 to 30%. and in some products it goes down to 10 or 5%, because what happens in the tender space is that you can't differentiate your product. Once you're licensed and you're approved, the challenge, and this is something we've taken up with the tender agency, the government bodies which issue the tenders, is that with a lot of price competition, what happens over a period of 4 to 5 years, you see manufacturers walking out of the business if it gets too competitive, because beyond a point you can't sustain your margins. Partly why we've been very successful, and a lot of people ask us what's different about Serum Institute, is that we were able to plan and foresee and invest in the infrastructure to make very high volumes. And our capacities were always very high. So when the demand went up sporadically, we were able to cater to those demands. And this was again partly because we were private limited, we could take these decisions. All I had to do was and my father was very generous in allowing me to do whatever I wanted. There was a lot of debate and arguments always, but ultimately he just, allowed me to do what I wanted, which then enabled the company to make these investments, which could have been looked at some point earlier on as risky or a little too aggressive, but ultimately it's all paid off, because that's why we've got the largest capacities, and that's why you can then fulfill that additional demand that no one could foresee came about in these vaccines.
But what are tender prices in the past 1 year?
They go down by 20-30% every year, which is great for the consumer, but it's not very good for the manufacturers as an area, because you spend 5 years developing a vaccine, your investments and your blood and sweat, and then in 3-4 years, if you see a huge erosion of the price, then that's not a very healthy situation in terms of even having enough vaccine. And ultimately, look, a country is dependent on these 2 or 3 vaccine manufacturers, and if they go out of business or choose to do something which is more profitable, then the country and the children would be naturally vulnerable to that.
But how lucrative is the private business when it comes to vaccines?
Well, it would have been lucrative where one could have made up your losses or your low margins in the government business. But what's happened is that the Indian government, unfortunately, the Price Control Authority has very illogically and irrationally put certain caps without looking into the costing or anything of these vaccines. And as a result, they've limited the MRPs of these vaccines. They're 100, 200 rupees. Some vaccines they've limited at 5 rupees a dose. Now, this is a constant battle. Now, how do you decide whether to deprive the children of vaccines at a loss, which we've been supplying these vaccines at a loss, and at the same time educate the government that you can't give something at 5 rupees today. Even a bhikari will not accept 5 rupees as a tip at a traffic light. How do you expect a vaccine to be made at 5 rupees a dose? So the government needs to understand that, and we're trying to explain that to them, but that's been a major wall that we've not been able to penetrate.
So currently, how much are you investing in R&D?
As I said, about $100 to $120 million a year goes in various clinical trials and research projects that we're doing, because in the last 3 to 4 years, we've been aggressively pursuing all these new vaccines and technologies. We're also investing heavily in monoclonals. One is it was called Herceptin for lung cancer for women. We've got a bladder cancer vaccine coming up for Europe and US. So we're entering the oncology space as well through monoclonals and vaccines. We've got the first in the world dengue monoclonal, which is not a vaccine, it's a cure. So within 2 days of hospitalization, I can cure you from dengue. But again, with our Indian rules that we have to sort of, which have been historically there, I'll be selling dengue monoclonals to foreign countries before we can even sell in our own country, which is a shame, and I'm trying to change that. And the price is not an issue there. It's more of being able to get through the regulatory barriers, where the permissions and licenses in the Modi government have drastically reduced, and the Prime Minister and his whole team have done a great job, but we still need to streamline and bring that to a single window kind of clearance, where you don't have to go to so many different committees and areas to get through a new product or a new development.
This price problem that you spoke about, is it impacting quality of products in India as well? Because currently we have this whole contamination issue with regards to the type 2 polio vaccines. 150,000 vials had been contaminated. So how do you justify that?
Well, eventually I think the price could affect the quality, because if you can't reinvest in your plant to make a better GMP facility, you'll find a point where you can't quote in these businesses, and that's why a lot of manufacturers have had to step out of the that product line or that business. Right now, I don't think it's affecting, the price is not affecting the quality, because you have to comply to your GMP requirements, otherwise you won't be licensed by the Indian regulator, who's quite particular in making sure that everything is proper. With regards to the recent polio issue, I can't comment because I don't know the facts. I don't know what happened in that company, so I can't comment on that. But it's not the price. What the price will affect is whether that company continues to produce the product itself or not. They'll either just stop it or they won't do it. I don't think that'll affect the quality.
What are the plans to acquire companies in India? You have a 14.8% stake in Panacea Biotech, same business as you, vaccines, but there's no movement.
Well, most of the vaccine companies are promoter held and owned. So unless they decide to sell their stake, it's not going to happen. Globally, because of a lot of companies being listed, it's been much easier to have those kind of consolidations and acquisitions. But here, a lot of the promoters who put in their blood and sweat in the companies and sort of treat it as their own baby, I think a lot of the promoters have received a lot of offers, not just from me, but from multinationals also. But I don't think anyone's selling in a hurry at the moment.
So what's the plan with Panacea in particular?
At the moment, nothing really. They've had their own share of struggles. They are trying to get around some of those struggles using their patent and IP issues. They've got some ambitious plans in their pharma portfolio. Let's see, in 2-3 years' time, they should turn around and do very well. They've got some very good ambitious plans. We've got a tie-up with them also for a hexavalent vaccine, which will be the first of its kind. They are the first to make a hexavalent vaccine, which is a 6-in-1, in the world. So 2 to 3 years down the line, would it be a possible acquisition, or is it just a strategic? No, I think it's just a strategic investment for now, and I don't see any merit in acquiring that company. They're doing very well. They have their own plans, and we had initially, yes, many years ago when we had invested, we thought maybe we could come together, but the promoters right now want to continue running that company, and they're doing a good job. So I think we don't have any plans to do anything there. You did sell some of your shares in Orchid Farmer. Have you exited it completely? Orchid was a classic example of why we will never diversify again. To your earlier question, we thought maybe we could enter the pharma space. Orchid was a leader in cephalosporins. That company was mismanaged and had its own issues, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but that's just been a write-off as perhaps the single biggest mistake that we've ever made. We've never made any other mistakes except for our investment in Orchid, because that company is now in CDR and is NCR. But you didn't ever think that you could acquire the company and turn it around and enter? Well, we tried to, but we had issues with the existing CEO and promoter, and that didn't work out. And the debt that they kept taking was without anyone's consent, and they sort of went further into a mess, and we just now are getting out of it at whatever value we can. So you won't ever enter the formulation space? No, I think we're going to stick to making vaccines, and as I said, at the most diversify into our new NBFC that we've formed to enter the financial services area. Okay, I'm going to get to the NBFC business in just a bit, but before that, you have a tie-up with Cipla as well to enter the US as well as the European market. Where do things stand? It's not yet taken off. No. So Cipla decided for their own reasons to shut down their front end, and they didn't want to continue doing what they had originally planned. So our strategy was to use Cipla's network to sell in Europe and the United States. Since they have now changed their strategy on that, we now only have an existing tie-up for, I think, the South African market with them, and nothing else at the moment. But we can always look at other synergies if they come about. So at the moment, there's hardly it's a very small relationship for the South African market that we have with Cipla. There was a lot of speculation that there could be a possible merger between Cipla and Serum. You've clarified that wasn't the plan ever, but yes, and because you've got the next generation in Cipla also running that. Usually, you know, if the next generation is not interested, only then there is a possibility of a merger or a sale. But we also discussed it in the sense that there isn't really any major added value for either company by coming together, because the synergies, unless there's major synergies now, for example, Sun Pharma, Ranbaxy, they saved a lot of costs, and there were other strategic reasons, so that made sense. Whereas for us, being a vaccine company and they're in a completely different area, there are very limited synergies. So I think the rumor just remained a rumor, and there was no real, I mean, even after the rumor, we thought about whether we should act on a rumor, but there wasn't really much sense to it, so we just left it.
Okay. You have plans of entering the NBFC space.
Yes.
You spoke about it last year. Where do the plans stand currently?
Well, last year we were looking at a lot of proposals to acquire the NBFCs, and the valuations were naturally very high. Of course, people didn't agree with me, but I'm sure they agree with me now. Today, given the situation that we see in the market, where it's been a bloodbath, and that's why I've changed my strategy a little bit to look at the consumer space and retail space, instead of giving these high-ticket loans and going into, you know, lending to real estate builders, or to lending to small businesses, medium-sized businesses, because the risk profiles are very different. We're looking at now lending to individuals, lending online, lending for consumer spending, whether it's on online sites and other, using apps and technology today, where the cost base will be low. The customer acquisition cost will be low. And lending to, you know, an area which is not, you know, going into the micro housing finance or the very unsecured space, where the risks are high. Of course, the returns are also high. We looked at a small company called Micro Housing Finance, which then we didn't acquire. I think the Birla Group eventually bought it recently. So we changed our strategy from what it was a year ago, and in about 2 months' time, we're going to launch the NBFC with a few products and then build on that from there.
And what is the corpus?
Well, we're putting in about 400 to 500 crores at the moment, and then we'll keep funding and topping it up as it grows. But I want to scale up in a very slow and systematic manner. We might not even deploy this amount for at least 2 years, and then build it from there. You know, I don't want to build a book so fast that will, you know, land us up in some of the troubles that these NBFCs
so
have been facing.
The recent happenings in the NBFC space, that hasn't made you cautious about your plans?
Yeah, it has made me cautious. In fact, that's why I said we've changed our strategy a little bit, and we're going to only stick to lending, you know, against, say, salary or a pre-approved sort of people who have got their existing track record of paying on time, and, you know, professionals, salaried professionals, and or small private business owners. So that way it's a very, you know, the ticket size per loan will be much smaller. That way the risk is also much less.
But
for an NPA or a default.
You mentioned that the valuations were high 1 year ago, which stopped you from acquisitions. You've also looked at an acquisition, you mentioned. Valuations have come down drastically now. Are you shopping?
Yes, well, not shopping at the moment, but certainly if some of the good NBFCs which weren't, you know, or will not have these sort of issues, if they come about with reasonable valuations, we can certainly look at it. But there are very few well-run NBFCs, and those few well-run NBFCs are, of course, of a very big size, and, you know, we can't look at acquiring something as big as, you know, 40, 50,000 crores, where some of these guys have that kind of market cap. And so we will look at maybe up to $1 billion to $2 billion valuations for a very well-run NBFC, but I don't see that happening immediately, because there aren't any like that for sale which are run in that manner.
Okay, that's on the NBFC space, but are you looking to broaden your horizon within the financial space? For example, say, apply for a banking license if possible. What are your plans? Say,
well, that was the dream, but I think that would probably be 10 years away from now. Some of the best well-run NBFCs who've asked and wanted a banking license, with the existing regulations, it's virtually impossible. And you've got to build up a certain track record and do so many things before you can get a banking license. So we're very far away from that. Of course, that would be ideal, because your cost of funds go down, but I'm not even looking at that right now. I'm only looking at improving my treasury income right now by having, a relatively risk-free, well-run, safe NBFC business.
Okay, so if we were to have this conversation, say, 3 years down the line, what exactly would the business look like? How much would be vaccines and how much would be the rest?
Oh, I think still 95% would be vaccines. This is just a new startup. Virtually, you can call it a startup. So it's going to take a long time before it really builds scale and is significant. The other part, in our business, we've got a few townships that we're looking at developing. We've got some land parcels that we'll develop. So we've got a nice real estate play of 400 to 500 acres, which we'll slowly start developing. So I'm looking at that along with the NBFC space. But the NBFC is really a startup today, and I think in about 4 or 5 years' time, we could probably talk about it a little bit more in a substantial manner.
There were reports that maybe there could be a stake sale in Serum. You could probably diversify a little part of your business or dilute a little bit of your business. Where do things stand?
Well, about 2 or 3 years ago, that was something we seriously considered. We had meetings with funds and others who were interested. That was initially triggered because we needed at least 1.5 to 2 billion equity. In terms of cash, which we didn't have for acquisitions that we were looking at doing. When those acquisitions didn't really pan out, both in India and globally, we sort of decided against bringing in the funds, because eventually that would mean and imply that you'd have to list and become accountable and all of that, which we didn't want to do at this stage unless we really needed the funds. So since we didn't for the acquisitions, we then closed the discussion, and for now, we said we'll leave that as
So what if a GSK comes knocking on your door, or Pfizer, or maybe an Indian pharmaceutical company that wants to diversify?
No, if it's a multinational who wants to buy a stake in Serum, no, we decided and toyed with it a lot, but we've concluded and decided that we would never sell. And this is something we want to keep growing because of the impact it has on humanity. Because ultimately, if you sold it for a few $1 billion, what would I do with the funds? The impact that we can make through vaccines today is unparalleled. There's no foundation, there's no social work anyone does today that can save the kind of lives that vaccine companies save. Just to put things in perspective, and I don't know, it's related to the volumes, but Serum Institute has saved at least 500,000 lives every year for the last, I would say, 4 decades. So I don't know who can do that and who can have that impact. And you have all the other vaccine companies also saving lives. So the vaccine space is not just a business, it's also got a humanitarian angle to it, which is very close to our family, and that's why we may at the most raise some funds, but to make other acquisitions to further consolidate our position, but not for us to sell out. And cash out or anything like that.
Okay, well, we wish you the same. Thank you very much, Mr. Poonawalla, for joining in and talking to CNBC TV.
Thank you for having me.